And clearly, one of the interesting things is, did the victim suffer? Well, when you have defensive wounds, you know that the victim suffered.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all of those
Well, when
things.
Xana's finger was almost off.
Right. So we know they suffered. And when you suffer, that's something that certainly brings about the need for the death penalty. So it is interesting, though. Just last week, I talked to a group about an individual who is charged with a similarly heinous crime. Okay, not as noteworthy as the one we're talking about with Kohberger, but he all of a sudden he killed a police officer in Nassau County, which is north of Jacksonville. And there's a special provision: you kill a law enforcement officer, somebody, a first responder, those kind of things, the death penalty is always on the table. And this individual, before trial now, has pled guilty. And the hope of pleading guilty is because you're showing contrition. You're showing that you have remorse, that you have a heart to not put the other witnesses and the other family members through a trial. Those kind of things will create in the minds of jurors and in the mind of the judge, perhaps a little bit of, it was me, I did it. But if you go to trial and you say, I didn't do it, Murdoch and maybe Kohberger, then the court really does get irritated by that. Okay, the court is not happy that you put everybody through it when it's evident that you're guilty. And so the court is empowered to give you a heavier sentence. Did you know that? Just a heavier sentence. And here's another interesting, odd bit of fact, too, that not a lot of people know, that in Japan, you're allowed to have somebody sit in for you as the defendant.
Really?
Yeah. You don't have to sit there yourself, which makes perfect sense, right? Because what that does, in my mind, that makes perfect sense, because what that does is it takes the personal aspect out of it, right?
Yeah, that does make sense from that point of view.
So I don't look at you and I have an internal bias against in Japan, an Anglo-Saxon, right? And so I see the Anglo-Saxon and I go, he may not be guilty, but I'm going to make him guilty, right? And I know many examples in the course of my career where people wanted to be on a jury just to screw with the defendant because of their nationality, their origin, variety of things. And they've made statements to that. So, it makes sense that you just put somebody in there and then you only consider the facts, right? You only consider the evidence and you only consider the witnesses who you can judge for their credibility. But it takes out the idea that that person is evil. I've always found that, and the fact that the investigator in France, the detectives, they actually work for both the prosecution and the defense, both. So if I'm a defense attorney and I need something, I go to the detective helps me find that information. So the combination of those two things really might advance the interest of all of us in dealing out justice to whoever's charged. And another thing that I want to mention to you, until your ox is gored, you're always angry at somebody who commits a crime.
Mm-hmm.
But then if it's your son or your daughter who commit the crime, all of a sudden the shoe's on the other foot, and you're like, well, wait a minute. My child's a really good child, and it's just a matter of circumstance that this all happened, and they shouldn't hold that against them. I mean, I have heard that argument from families of defendants frequently.
Like, we always want justice at the deepest level until it happens to us. Exactly.
That's right. But I tell you, as we grow older, and you're not anywhere near there yet, but as we grow older, we begin the process of learning that we need to absorb the experiences that we have in our lives and put them to our benefit instead of becoming the perennial victim. so that, oh, it's all never my fault. I'm never at fault. It's always somebody on the outside.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to take those failings that we all have, and we have successes, but our failings, and use them to our benefit. And it's really interesting. I'll tell a little personal story. I'm 72 now, and I was an agent for years. I worked on a lot of the tactical teams. I was a cop in the inner city in Miami back in the cocaine cowboy days. So I felt pretty tough and pretty sure of myself around strangers, right? Because when you're a cop and you're enforcing the laws, you're around strangers pretty much all the time. So I went down under my building, which was an under level parking garage, and I saw a guy who was trespassing, and he was relieving himself on a pole, a column that supports my building. And I hollered at him as I approached him, right? And he didn't flee. He just ran straight at me and sucker punched me, right?
Mm.
Well, I later found out who he was, and I had to make some hard determinations, okay? And some of the determinations I had to deal with were, well, if I prosecuted him, I'm going to be on a witness stand. I don't want to be on a witness stand. If I prosecute him, I'm going to get interviewed by a bunch of people, and I'm I'm notable, at least in Jacksonville. People know who the hell I am, and I don't want that kind of negative publicity.
Right.
I mean, here I am getting beat by a young guy that I ought to be able to manage. And
Yeah,
obviously could not, right? And then I thought it further through, and I recognized that this was a lesson that I needed to learn, because I'm not quite as swift as I might once have been. And I need to use a little more caution when I deal with people.
Right.
Ultimately, that will protect me and save my life, right?
Yeah.
But I absorbed that problem. I didn't, and so I never pursued prosecuting the guy because he's got nothing. It wouldn't make any difference, right? And even though I'm older, so that it's a felony, assaulting me, what's the point? Who's going to benefit from that? And the answer is nobody.
Right. Yeah.
So
you're exactly right. I'm wondering too what your thoughts and perspectives are on some of the new developments in the case. For example, the fact that he's standing in his kitchen separating trash out of his family's trash into Ziploc bags. That to me is clear and obvious that he's trying to hide his DNA. And
well,
then
listen, timing is everything in law enforcement. Truly. If you've ever been on a surveillance, it's fascinating work, right? It's not like it is in the movies, okay? What it is, here's how it is, all right?
That seemed like a movie scene, kind of. They bust in the house at 2 a.m, and there he is in the kitchen doing something nefarious.
Right. But what generally happens is this, and this is why what happened here was really amazing in my view. Surveillance is hours of just monotony, just absolute monotony, because there's nothing happening, right? The advent of cameras and video surveillance has changed all of that. But we used to sit in a car for hours. And if you had to relieve yourself, you had a bucket to do that in, okay? Wow. You couldn't get out of the car. And that's why the dome lights don't work in police cars or old police cars, because if you open the door, it would light up everything, right? You don't want that. So you'd sit there for hours and hours and hours, and finally you'd start dreaming about something, not asleep, but just thinking, daydreaming, we call it, even though it was at night. And you would look away from that door for just the briefest of moments.
1 millisecond, yeah.
And that's when the action happened. You weren't even seeing it.
Yeah.
And so in this particular case, though, they timed it correctly. And you've got to wonder whether or not, with the use of drones, the use of electronic cameras, the use of all of those things. Remember, you got a search warrant, right? And the issue with a search warrant is to collect and preserve evidence and to protect yourself, right? That's the whole point of an official search warrant, and to meet with the requirements of the Fourth Amendment. And so you wonder if they just didn't put cameras looking into the house, and you wait for the perfect moment. Instead of randomly just going to the house, you wait till it's dark, the kitchen light comes on, and you go, this is the time. And you may have a video feed watching what's happening. But when they went in and found him with gloves on, and he's taking care of stuff that he clearly doesn't want his DNA on, I mean, that to me is admissible evidence.
Yeah.
Because it demonstrates a desire to hide, okay? Sort of like fleeing from law enforcement. If you flee, then there's a good possibility that you're guilty, right? Police officer drives up, there's a house with a busted window, you run off, it's presumed that you broke the window, at least initially, right? So, no, that's not always the case, but in Florida, that was so grained in the law for many years, as it was predominantly in the rural southern part of the country. If you fled from a police officer, guess what the police officer could do to stop you?
Yeah.
I mean, that just to me today is just unbelievable. But I knew it to be true when I was working.
Yeah.
But you'd hate to kill somebody over a broken window, right?
Yeah. Or if there was some level of confusion, it was an accidental.
Absolutely. But
there were reports of two things. One, it was a gated area that the police officer SWAT team had to go into to get to Bryan Kohberger's house. They didn't have access to the code at first, which is kind of interesting considering they were doing surveillance. And the second thing is, I looked at the Flight Radar 24, which is a website. You can type in any date and time in any part of the country and see what the aircraft coverage at that time looked like. And there was a Cessna, a small Cessna plane that was circling the house for over an hour just before that raid took place of the Kohberger house.
What do you think that was?
Well, I mean, you would indicate that there's some level of law enforcement, Pennsylvania State Police watching or FBI watching from above, certainly. It's interesting they're doing that and not using drones, or maybe they're also using drones. Right. Maybe they thought he might try to get away and then they'd have eyes. I don't know.
Fixed wing aircraft is the preferred method because it allows a pilot in charge, and a navigator. And I often served in that odd function to watch the ground and to see what's going on.
I see. And
then you can communicate that to any number of units on the ground. But today, and I don't doubt that was either a Bureau aircraft or a state police aircraft, because fixed wing is so easy to use, simple to fly. 182 is what you're talking about. And those are really durable aircraft, and they're pretty safe to fly in.
What about it being at night? They'd have to have, I guess, some level of night vision cameras from above.
There are also specialized aircraft that only work at night, but they're not Cessnas. They're military aircraft.
Well, this was a Cessna.
Well, it may have been listed as a Cessna.
Oh, I see. And they do stuff like that? They change up?
Oh, absolutely. We had thermal imaging cameras back in the 80s that were used for that very purpose.
Very interesting. What level of disinformation?
No, but I think it's always important to understand that the way it seems to work with the government is that the NSA has the first dibs on stuff, okay? And then it rolls down to the CIA, and then it rolls down to the law enforcement agencies. I mean, that's the way that happens.
I didn't know that.
It's not unusual we had back in the 70s, we had a little transmitter that was about the size of a box of matches. Now, people probably don't even know what the hell that is anymore.
Yeah.
But it was called a T4. You could have 2 channels on it. And they were specialized. They were not encrypted channels because we had yet to go to encrypted channels, but we had special frequencies, right? And they were high band 800 hertz series. So they were fairly short distance, but they were also something that the citizens couldn't really get a hold of. I say that's not entirely true, right? But we had that equipment, and we also had a thing called a Nagra tape recorder that was about this size, and it was actually reel to reel, two small reels. And it had twin mics that you would put right about here on a chest and wrap them in cotton. And those would pick up sounds. If you listened to it later on headphones, it was as though you were present. And all of that worked down from government channels up above. Oddly enough, the Nagra recorders were used for many years by Hollywood to get that really perfect sound that you often hear.
Yeah. Wow.
But the surveillance techniques have gotten way more far advanced. I mean, we used to be concerned that the Soviets would put a laser up against an office window, and in so doing, the minute vibrations of a keyboard could be translated into the actual text of what was being typed. So there are strategies and techniques that are available for surveillance today, I'm sure. I mean, if I were doing it, which I'm not today, but I would send a drone in there and I'd put 2 or 3 cameras, with independent batteries looking into the house. You could do that today. Whereas in my era, you'd have to run hardwire to do that sort of thing. And by the way, that wasn't above us. What was known as CCTV camera looking into the kitchen or the rooms if we had authorization to do so, or it was for national security. Foreign counterintelligence operations in the FBI are not subject to the same rules and regulations that are for civilians.
What kind of things could they have been doing with Bryan Kohberger that we don't know about?
Well, I mean, look, one of the things, and of course the Bureau denied this, is you're following a guy all the way across the country. You're bound to lose him.
They did lose him, according to sources.
Well, I hear that, and then I hear them deny it, but you're bound to, right? So how do you solve that problem? And you solve that problem with what we saw, whisper stop, right? Now, whisper stop doesn't anticipate that there'll be another actual stop by police on the highway. So you end up with 2 stops. That seems kind of odd, but only one of them was a whisper stop where an agent or somebody involved in the actual transit contacted them. This is the car. We think it's on I-4 or whatever the hell it is. And that brings me another memory. When I was an agent, if I left my house and I had to go to Tallahassee, I had to put down the car I was in, who I was with, the ETA for various intersections that I would cross going to Tallahassee, because otherwise the FBI didn't have a way to get in touch with me when I was needed. So it was really exacting. Yeah. So clearly the Bureau has connections with all law enforcement. And when we have a thing called the National Academy, where we bring individuals who are really good cops to the academy and give them additional training and things like that. So there's a relationship. Hell, I used to have a relationship with Bob Brotherton, who was the police chief in Hong Kong. So those are the kind of relationships that you have. And those relationships can be used to make a car stop that car, see who the hell's in it. Now, because of body cameras today, right, they were able to see things later that were helpful to them. For example, was he wounded? There's some speculation that he was wounded while he was driving back with his father in the car. Plus, you want to know that you got the right car and that it is who you think it is, right? Yeah. Because if you screw that up, they won't get fired, but they're certainly not going to be very happy at headquarters with you for losing them.
No, I think that's really interesting. Did you go through the list of the items that they seized from his house?
I did. And let me tell you the most interesting one that I saw. And people don't really know this. I taught death investigations for the FBI for a number of years, along with other major courses related to a variety of things. And one of the things I taught was Ted Bundy. Who was he? How do we figure that out, right? And Ted Bundy, when he was arrested, we ultimately seized a whole bunch of materials. he would sit down in front of a mirror and he would sketch himself while he was in disguise. Okay, he would sketch himself. So he often used a cast, and I have
Mhm.
this memory of my in my mind of seeing all these slides that I had produced that I used to teach, and I can remember he would have his cast like this, and of course he didn't have an injury; it was a fake cast, and
Mhm.
he would have a mask on, and he would draw himself, you know, and he was a fairly not good artist, but a decent drawer, so he could draw himself really effectively. When they raided Kohberger's place, they found hand-drawn images.
They did.
And it occurs to me that he would have known of Bundy, may have had access to the same thing materials that I used for teaching because he
Yeah.
was in that behavior, right?
Yeah.
And may have seen that Bundy did that and emulated that. I mean, that'd be fascinating, but it just doesn't describe the hand-drawn sketches.
There are certainly a lot of lap or I would say overlap between Bundy, between the BTK killer, between Elliot Rodger, if you're familiar with Elliot Rodger, who's the father of the incel movement, is sort of the way that they describe him, or the founder of the incel movement. So there are some definite clue pieces that either we're just stretching and we're trying to make something out of nothing, or like you said, he was a student of serial killers and he may have either advertently or inadvertently allowed it to get deep in him.
Well, we also know that he asked in his search for a doctorate, he was asking individuals how they felt when they committed crimes and getting into the specifics of that sort of thing. So that's not a far leap to drawing an image of yourself when you're in costume.
Right.
Right. So I think all of these individuals who are predatory and they're not only, but they're parasites too.
Yeah.
And so the consequence is that they have similar behavioral characteristics.
Yeah.
The problem is, unless you know somebody really, really well, you'll never see those characteristics.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me that if you interview a killer, a child killer, a sexual child killer, one of the ways that have been very successful in getting them to confess is for the investigator to pretend to be themselves interested in child pornography, as an example. Okay.
I see.
So you're behaving as though they're behaving, and they are reaching out because they would love to find somebody who has a similar desire for criminal behavior in order,
Yeah.
right, to participate with them. That's the art of communication, really. And so there's little doubt in my mind that these people behave in similar ways.
Mhm.
And they certainly look. I knew early on, and I talked with Nancy Grace about this. I said, you're going to find a sniper's hide.
Yeah.
They think that's something you wear, like a ghillie suit, right? No. A sniper's hide is where you hide up behind the house and you look at somebody's windows that are open or not well covered for a period of time. And sure enough, we know based on telemetry that he was there for at least 12 times, right?
Yeah.
And so in my mind, it's clear he was watching these people. And I did a brief video on the dangers that particularly young women encounter when they don't recognize the danger of open displays of themselves to the outside.
Mhm.
Because men are very visually driven, women
Mhm.
not so much. I mean, I got involved in an interesting conversation with Nancy Grace and some others, and when I was teaching these courses, I learned a funny thing. If you ever went into a magazine store, which there are not many of those left anymore, but there used to be a plethora of magazine stores in any city you'd go into. Typically, they were divided They were divided into two sides. You had the women's side and the men's side. And if you walked in the men's side, you would see in cellophane, you would see girly magazines, right? Playboy and others, just, and they were in plastic so that you couldn't peruse them, right? Okay. On the other side, there were women's magazines. Do you have any idea what women's magazines were in cellophane?
I have no idea. Romance novel type?
Nope.
Reader's Digest? I have no idea.
Nope. Wedding magazines.
Oh.
And there, my friend, is the difference between the two sexes. Right there. Men are interested in the way women look and appear and that sort of thing. And women are interested in a relationship because they bear the largest responsibility for reproduction, right? I mean, they're going to be with the child for 9 months, and then the child isn't on their own. So they really have to bear. And that's why I think it's really important for women to be careful what they display of themselves, because they put themselves at risk to individuals who are potentially not off the rails. They're off the rails, the individuals, and you can't see them. And we've dealt with instances where somebody would climb a 30-foot tree to look in a window. Well, that's not something a woman's going to do, right? That's something a young guy's going to do. So I think we have to warn people about those potential dangers. Earlier society did 30 years ago, not so much today.
Very fascinating. Are you familiar with Elliot Rodger and the incel? I know we've talked about incel last time you're on here, but there was an interesting discovery that we came across on Elliot Rodger's manifesto, which is page 118, is the page I went and read inside of it, considering there was page 118 underlined. So I'm just racking my brain. What could he have possibly underlined on page 118? And he just talks about how, because women wouldn't sleep with him, they deserve to die. And any man that was sleeping with the beautiful women, they deserve to die too. And he said it needed to happen on November 2013, which is interesting considering this was November 13th when this took place. So I'm not saying it's a stretch again, but there's a lot of things I think we look at Elliot Rodger and what took place there, and then with Bryan Kohberger and the idea of an incel.
I'm not really familiar with that individual with whom you spoke. I'm familiar with the incel movement.
Yeah,
I'm certainly aware that it's a complexity. I mean, the population of Japan has started to decline steadily.
Right.
The
China too.
Right, it's a problem, and it's a problem in part because one of the biggest weapons, and that's not the right word, the biggest skill set that a woman has is to just look at a man and deem him not acceptable.
Right. It's a superpower.
It is. It's a superpower. And young men just can't absorb that. And I think that's unfortunate because we need to have personal relationships, and we need that. We shouldn't be living in a virtual world. I mean, there's a real world out there, and it's got to be better than a virtual world. But we see increasingly the incels are into the virtual world. And when you have things like GChat and iChat and where you can communicate with an artificial intelligence, when that manifests itself in the way of a silicon sister that is also mechanical,
right,
you're going to have a real crisis on your hands.
A big crisis.
I think. I think.
No, I've been studying this. There's a guy that actually posts a video every single day where he's been talking about the declining population in certain countries, especially countries that we've relied on for certain things, and how that's going to really impact the global structure and the global system. China's on the other end of it. Japan's on the other end of it. And the United States would also be on the other end of it, by the way, if they didn't allow immigration in the way that they do. And I'm not talking about the ones that are coming illegally. I'm just saying we have a great immigration policy that bolsters our population and continues to see an increase in it. However, with the key demographics that they're looking at, natural born United States citizens, there's a decrease as well. So there's a decrease across the board in all major nations.
Well, it's interesting. Let me mention, I used to have an abattoir. I'm sorry, an apiary. I didn't have an abattoir, but I had an apiary. So I raised bees for a long time. And you don't know this, but perhaps, maybe you do. But if somebody sets up any number of beehives next to your beehives, and there are a more substantial number of beehives next to your beehives will be robbed. In other words, your bees will leave,
Yeah.
and the other bees will come and get the honey that those bees left. Okay? You know, the United States is like all those beehives next to the other countries.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to come to America. And that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
The key here is we want people who are hard, industrious workers who believe in the same principles that we do in the Constitution. I mean, they should be welcomed with open arms, because that's how we get our talent. I mean, look at Elon Musk.
Exactly.
And the left really doesn't like him now. The right has embraced him. It's switched back and forth over the decades.
5 years ago was the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's amazing to me what brilliance that individual has. And there are others.
And he's an immigrant. And I always felt like, just from my own observations, the more diversity that exists often leads to the greatest breakthroughs in innovation. And so I'm totally on board with you in that.
Well, let me be clear about my idea of diversity. In my world, if you're just picking diversity based on the obvious, right?
I agree with you on that. Yeah.
You know, if you're just on that basis, the entire system declines, because if you're working in an organization, you want the very best people in that organization. Exactly. I have that here in my law office. Now I have a variety. There's a diversity here, believe me, but I can tell you that they're the top of their effort, field, and skill sets. So, and I create a working environment that's pleasurable for them. They basically run their own cases. They show up when they want to. They don't have a boss hanging over their neck saying, "Where are you? And what the hell have you been doing? Why weren't you doing this?" Because that's insulting, right?
Yeah.
People do what they're going to do, and I praise them when they do well. So that behavior doesn't exist in typical industry, in my experience. In fact, it's just the opposite. You have people standing on you to get higher.
It's true.
And so I think that we want a diversity, because we want a diversity of ideas and opinions, but we don't want a diversity just based on some list that some idiot has created and said, this is the list that'll make the world a better place, because that's not true, in my view.
Why do you think so many people like Bryan Kohberger find faith while they're in prison?
Oh, you know, Jesus lives in the jail, right?
Well, that is a true statement from my perspective.
No, wait, he does. There used to be an old jail here in Jacksonville. And if you were to go into that jail, which was, by the way, on Liberty Street, okay? If you went into the jail, it was dark and dank, and there were plaster walls, okay? It was not tile, as it is often today, plaster walls. And I have seen some of the most spectacular renderings of the Christ that you've ever seen in your life, painted on those walls inside the jail cells. And it's only tongue in cheek that I say Jesus is in the jail, but while they're there, there's only one potential hope for them, and that's it.
Yeah.
It's true. So everybody seems to, I'm praying with God, and what I think a true Christian recognizes is the Roman coin, right? right? You pay to Caesar what's Caesar's. And if you do a crime, you're going to be paying in this lifetime and to this society. Now, God may have forgiven you, and you may be saved, and you may go on to live eternally. Certainly, that's my hope for myself and the people I love. But I can tell you that you're going to pay your piper here.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's really good. I think sometimes from my perspective, as somebody who watches these kinds of things closely, it feels like some of them do it as a way to sway the jury. And
No question. No
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
And I guess if you're innocent, truly innocent, which, by the way, none of us are truly innocent.
Yeah, true.
I decry the fact that, and I have people say this, well, the police can search anything I've got because I don't have anything to hide. That's not true for any of us. And it's the government. It'd be one thing for God to search your soul, but it's another thing for you. You got to recognize that the government has no soul. They have no morality. They are a system, an organized system. And that system, when it interfaces with you, can destroy you without even intending to.
Yeah.
We used to break down doors in houses to search them. Do you think we ever repaired that door? That we had a carpenter with us who would come up and say, hey, sorry, let me fix this. No.
I had that thought about Bryan Kohberger's door with duct tape shut after they were done there. I was like, I wonder if his dad's now having to fix that.
I worry that here's another worry I have about law enforcement related to Murdoch and Kohberger and even Bundy. We don't do the basic searches for evidence that we used to do. We have all this fancy technology, the phone cameras, and all that stuff now, right? But we don't do the simple stuff, like a good physical search, plaster casting of shoe impressions. People don't even know what the hell that is anymore.
Yeah.
And that takes time for the investigator, and the investigator is going to get dirty. And today we've done this weird thing. When I was an agent, we did everything. There wasn't an aspect of the case that we were involved in that we weren't personally doing. Sort of like handmade shoes, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we did everything. Today, it's not that way. We have an ID technician, right, who shows up in the van and they perform the actual survey for evidence. And then there may be somebody else who actually photographs the evidence and somebody else who does other aspects of the collection and preservation and all that. What you have there is a thing called deniability, right?
Yeah.
But if you're the only person in charge of it and you didn't do it, where's the deniability? It's just you, right? And so I think in many ways things were better back in the earlier times when we did what I consider more thorough physical searches and investigations. We didn't rely on the technologies we do today. And we do absolutely rely on it today.
We 100% do. In fact, I think that's going to be some of the biggest pieces of evidence they're going to try to use against Bryan Kohberger. Another thing that I wanted to get your take on was, because I've heard conflicting reports about this. So the items that they took from his house, some people have said that they just take everything. Other people have said they're only taking things that they think are connected to the case, possibly. Well, which is it?
You take everything. I mean, I know agents who and we used to have phone booths. I don't know whether you ever remember those, but there were coin that you put a phone in and you actually dial the number. Originally, it was a rotary phone, and then there were buttons you'd push, dial, and you put money. We loaded up the entire phone booth, unhooked it, unbolted it from the ground, and sent it to the laboratory. Right?
Can you extract data off of it?
Well, you can't screw that up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if there's any hairs or fibers or there's any DNA, today DNA, and back then it was fingerprints. If there was anything, they could manage it. And you didn't get jammed up with not doing it exactly as the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. would have done it. The point is, you tended to be very thorough when you're the lightning bolt connection to the problem, right? And I don't see that today. One of the interesting things is in the Murdaugh matter, when the police showed up and they thought, no doubt, initially, he was Alex Murdaugh was the killer, no doubt. They had that in their mind. But you certainly set up a perimeter. Yeah. And what's the first thing you do? You call for dogs, right?
Yeah.
And you search the perimeter. Why wouldn't you do that?
Right.
And so those are the more, as I said, those are the more traditional investigative techniques. And I think we've discarded those to our own discredit.
No, I agree with that totally. We have a question.